Hi, this is Christopher Perrin. Welcome to this introduction to a course which is called An Introduction to Classical Education. This is kind of an introduction to an introductory course. I remember when I was in seminary and studying a course on the Gospels and spent an enormous amount of time studying the Gospels with our professor, and at the end of the course I remember the professor saying, "I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the Gospels." And I remember thinking, wait a minute, I'm in graduate school. How can this be an introductory course? But it was. A lot of educators have said throughout the years that in one sense, all education is self-education. In other words, you're trained, you're encouraged, you're mentored, you're inspired by others. But, at the root of it, you have to do the study. You have to become your own student and to some degree, your own teacher. This is what Dorothy Sayre says in the end of her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. The end of education is that a student would learn to teach himself, to be his own teacher, to learn for himself. Not only did Sayre say this, classical educators have said this for centuries. So this will be an introductory course designed to prompt and to stimulate and I hope to guide and help, but it will be the beginning. It will not certainly be the end, even when this course is finished, certainly not when this introduction to an introductory course is finished. But I want to thank you for coming, journeying with me, and even taking a look at this first lecture. Well, you'll see that in this image on the slide, I have a puzzle piece, some puzzle pieces, and a partially formed puzzle. In one sense, we are going to seek to try to pull together the pieces of a puzzle. In fact, there are many different pieces that come to us in the classical tradition. The difficulty is we've never seen all of them together with a great integrated unity, have we? It's as if we've gone on a summer vacation with our extended family, and one of our relatives pulls out a big jigsaw puzzle of 1,000 pieces and says, we're going to put together this puzzle this week right here on the coffee table, and then the dog eats the box top. How do we pull together all of these pieces without having a sense of what the whole is? That will be one of our challenges. So we want to kind of pull together these pieces and look at them as a whole. Now, you might see this particular puzzle and think, well, gosh, there are 12 different items, concepts listed here on this puzzle. Is this the only way of conceptualizing classical education? No, it's not. But I'm trying to illustrate that there are pieces that we need to see together as a whole. And I think these are some of the pieces. I think they're important, but this might not be the definitive list. So how are we going to do this? Well, I think there are four major questions that every educational approach has to ask. Who is the student? What curriculum do we teach that student? In what setting? And to what ends or purpose? This will orient the way I present this course to you. These four questions should kind of loom in the background. What is a student? What is a human being? What is a human being for? And after we've answered that question, or the anthropological question, then we can address the curricular question. What do we teach that student? And in what setting? What does it mean to have a school or homeschooling community? And what is the purpose of it all? That should guide the whole affair. We could change this to change the analogy, perhaps from the puzzle to pearls. There are some lovely ideals and ideas and concepts and practices of education that have come down to us throughout the centuries. And they're like treasured pearls. And you've come across some of these pearls. You probably have a few of them in your own little pocket. But we maybe have never seen all of these pearls strung nicely so that they form a beautiful necklace. Again, we need a kind of integrated beauty and unity to understand and appreciate what we can call the classical tradition of education. It has some unity in the midst of its diversity. These pearls come together. Well, what are some of these pearls? Again, we could come up with different ways of naming the various pearls, the various important elements of the classical tradition of education, but let me suggest that at least these should be included as pearls. The liberal arts. We should know what the liberal arts are. We should know them very well. We should know their history and their purpose. what they seek to do. We should know pedagogy, the associated teaching methods for teaching the liberal arts. And there's a pearl, the great books. We should know what the great books are. We should know something of the great conversation, the great ideas that have been talked about by the greatest minds over the years. How do we mine the treasures of these great books? Schole, this idea of undistracted time to study the things that are most worthwhile, a restful contemplative learning. Where is the schole in our schools and homeschools? This is a pearl to recover. And what about virtue? This word that is its meaning almost lost in our contemporary moment. What is virtue, and what are the educational virtues? There's a collection of traditional virtues, habits, dispositions, or character traits that describe what a student should be. What are those virtues? How do we get these pearls on a string so that we recover an integrated, meaningful classical education? Well, that's what we'll seek to do in this introductory course, and in a sense is what we're seeking to do on ClassicalU generally. So if we want to pull together the pieces of the puzzle, we want to put the pearls on a string. It's also important to pause and say that as we look at the classical tradition that's come down to us, that we recognize it as something beautiful and good, a rich, wonderful inheritance, and that we affirm it, even as we affirm what it means to be a human being in this wonderful world, even though it's broken, even though there's a lot of lostness and there's fallenness, there's corruption. This world still is beautiful. As Gerard Manley Hopkins has said, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. We still see goodness and truth and beauty, a kind of glory in the cosmos that attracts us to it and makes us feel that it's good to be here. And we can affirm, in a sense, a kind of fundamental harmony of ourselves being placed in this world and seeking to know that harmony better. That's a part of the classical tradition. This idea of beginning with an affirmation of what it means to be in this world and to know this world, to know ourselves, to know the Creator. So, for example, Richard Weaver says this. He said in his book, Ideas Have Consequences. When we affirm that philosophy begins with wonder, we are affirming in effect that sentiment is anterior to reason. We do not undertake to reason about anything until we have been drawn to it by an affective interest. He's not saying all of life is sentimental. He's saying there is a kind of intuitive attraction to the world as something beautiful and good that effectively, that's with an A, draws us to begin to use our reason, knowing that we are in a place that is wonderful. And therefore we do philosophy because at first we are at wonder in the world, to quote Aristotle. All philosophy begins in wonder. So he goes on to say, Weaver does, that reason on its own without this foundation in wonder is actually going to be kind of reasoning in the void. It's going to be a kind of empty reasoning. And he says, for example, how frequently it is brought to our attention that nothing good can be done if the will is wrong. Reason fails to justify itself. It needs this will directed towards wonder to guide reason. He says, not without cause has the devil been called the prince of lawyers, and not by accident are Shakespeare's villains good reasoners. If the disposition is wrong, reason increases maleficence. If it is right, reason orders and furthers the good. So Weaver is arguing that we must use reason and we must use it well, but we ought not to be like Shakespeare's villains or the devil himself, who is the prince of lawyers. Our reason must be guided by a right disposition that is in wonder or at wonder in this lovely world that we find ourselves. So there's a kind of fundamental affirmation that's present and behind the tradition of classical education. Let me just quote him once again. Richard Weaver says, every man participating in a culture has three levels of conscious reflection, his specific ideas about things, his general beliefs or convictions, and his metaphysical dream of the world. And when he says that metaphysical dream of the world, he's referring again to that will that has been guided and oriented by wonder in the world, a metaphysical dream. So there's a kind of metaphysical priority, you might say, this idea of an ultimate reality that we find ourselves in that is true, good, and beautiful and causes us to be at wonder. Is that you? If that describes your disposition, then you are well suited, well disposed to the recovery of the classical tradition of education. But let me also refer to some other thinkers. Joseph Pieper has written, of course, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, leisure being schole, another translation for the Greek word schole, which is restful learning or undistracted time to study the things that are most worthwhile. In his book, Only the Lover Sings, on contemplation, he says this: "What then is required to celebrate a feast? Obviously, more than a day off from work. The requirement includes man's willing acceptance of the ultimate truth, in spite of the world's riddles, even when this truth is beheld through the veil of our own tears. It includes man's awareness of being in harmony with these fundamental realities and surrounded by them." He goes on, "To express such acceptance, such harmony, such unity in non-ordinary ways, this has been called since time immemorial to celebrate a feast." So Pieper is really saying the same thing that Weaver is, that we are to see this world as being shot through with grandeur and glory and goodness, and we are to be at wonder at it. And this leads us, therefore, to accept it with a kind of harmony, and only then can we be in a celebratory mood or mode. Only then can we really celebrate a feast and have festival. That's Pieper saying there's a fundamental way in which we affirm our position as human beings in this world. So there's just this beginning affirmative mode, and it becomes a kind of principle, maybe a fundamental principle of the classical tradition of education. Affirmation of what it means to be a human being in this world. And of course, in the Christian tradition, this becomes vitally important because we see that there is an Eden from which we have fallen, and an Eden to which we yearn to return, and a coming of a Savior who will bring us there. But we still see, in the midst of the veil of tears, in the midst of the fallenness of this world, the brokenness and the corruption, a fundamental wonder and goodness that we can affirm. That becomes a principle. And what is a principle other than it is a first thing? Weaver talks about this principle of affirmation as kind of an unsentimental sentiment or intuition that guides our reasoning. It becomes a kind of premise for our reasoning. Lewis talks about first things and second things. Of course, I'm referring to C.S. Lewis. He says this. He says, "Of course, this law, this fundamental principle, this law has been discovered before, but it will stand rediscovery. It may be stated as follows: every preference of a small good to a great, or a partial good to a total good, involves the loss of the small or partial good for which the sacrifice is made. You can't get second things by putting them first. You get second things only by putting first things first. If we don't put the first things first," Lewis says, "we will lose the second things as well." So sometimes we make the secondary primary. And of course, what Lewis is arguing is that there are some fundamental first things. And that's kind of what the word principle means. It's a first thing. Where do we start? What are the first things that we must get right if the secondary things are going to follow? And I'm arguing that as we begin the recovery of the classical tradition of education, that we get this right, that the world is true, good, and beautiful, and we are made such that we can know and perceive and love the things that are true, good, and beautiful. You might call this an assumption of, say, philosophical realism. You might call it Christian realism if you're in the Christian tradition, but that's what it is, a fundamental first premise that we are made such that we can know the things that are true, good, and beautiful. If we don't start with that premise, a lot of problems follow. In fact, Lewis will argue that if we don't start with this premise, we are really in danger of not being able to prove anything at all. There's something axiomatic about this kind of an assumption that truth exists and that truth can be known. If you don't believe that, you're going to find yourself in a world of individually created facts which are substituted for truths, in which every person does what is right in his own eyes, and a kind of chaos ensues over time, at least a kind of fragmentation. Many would argue that's what's happening in secular cultures today. So, principles. And you'll see throughout this course that we'll talk in terms of principles that enable us to use our reason well and to actually understand and derive practices. Practices and principles are, of course, in a kind of ongoing relationship, a virtuous cycle, we might say. And here's a slide that lists some of them. I won't go through them right now, but we will be seeing these later. Some principles that will guide us in our pedagogy in this case. Notice number 6 is wonder and curiosity. This is a fundamental first thing. Well, we'll see principles in a lot of other places too. We need to be able to think principially. In this famous psalm, you might ask yourself, and if you're there with a group of teachers, what principle or principles are contained within this psalm that might help us to predict future behavior or events? And by the way, that's something else that Weaver says. He says that when we come to understand principal truths, these are not lots of collections of isolated or collected facts. They are principles that enable us to actually predict and understand future events, situations, and so on, behaviors. The way a proverb can be a truth that helps us to understand and predict the future behavior. So what principles do you see here? What future behavior might you predict, or future events might you predict as you study this psalm? You'll see that there's at least one very important principle present. Or we could look at, say, a poem like this, a famous poem by Walt Whitman, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room. How soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. What is he describing here that you might think is a principle that could predict future behavior or events? This is a great poem to meditate on for educators because it contains two aspects of what it means to learn. One is, of course, to learn in the lecture room, kind of like you are right now, to have someone describe and teach and instruct directly through a lecture. You know, the word lecture is related to lectio, means to read something. So lectures used to be just read manuscripts, and you would listen. And there's a place for that. But notice that, excuse me, Whitman also articulates another way that we come to know things that are true, good, and beautiful, and that's to contemplate. When he goes out in the mystical moist night air and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. We'll learn later that in one sense, the beginning of this poem describes the use of ratio, reason that collects and classifies and does divide and add and figure. It's very important. It's a very important part of learning. It's a part of being a human being and exercising our capacities. Ratio. But then there was the intellectus, and the intellectus was that part of the mind, the medieval's thinking, that receptively engaged something that was true via contemplation, lingering, pondering, savoring. We come to know intuitively or intellectually as well as via our reason. And this poem gets at that. And so therefore, it gives to us a kind of principle of learning. We need both the ratio and the intellectus. Or we could look at a painting like this and ask ourselves, can we even derive and see principles embedded in a work of visual art? Well, many would say, We indeed can. This is a very famous painting. It's by Caspar David Friedrich, painted in 1818. It's titled "Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog." And if you were to take time contemplating this, maybe with a few prompts, I think you would discover some things. I mean, what do you notice about this as you look at it? What jumps out at you first? If you're like many who've contemplated this painting, you might say, well, there's certainly a clear play of light and darkness. Look at the darkness in the foreground and the lightness in the background. And of course, that's emphasizing another distinction, foreground and background. You might also, if you were to think about shapes, the way shapes are used in this painting, you might see that there's a play of shapes. If you had to choose one geometric shape that's frequently portrayed in this painting, what would it be? Well, it wouldn't be the circle, would it? No, it would be the triangle. If you look carefully, you'll see triangles in many different places. Even under the crook of his arm are two triangles put together, forming a diamond. And his elbow itself is forming a triangle. In fact, he's on a rock itself that forms a triangle going all the way up to first at the top of the rock, but you could follow the lines all the way up to the top of his head. And there you see something else, another principle of color that's embedded in this painting. Lots of darks and pale colors, only one flashing red color, which is the color of his hair. And notice its placement almost in the center of the painting. Is that purposeful? Well, those of you who know visual art, won't be surprised to hear that painters actually follow various principles when they paint. They take note of these things, and these things are done purposefully. There's also isolated color. There's a kind of tension also in this poem, another principle. Notice he's resting on his back foot but stepping forward with his front foot. Is he moving forward or is he resting? Is it a combination? Is he about ready to journey forth? Number of things going on in this poem that suggest a contemplative stance of the seafarer who is a wanderer, but perhaps has not stopped his wandering. He has yet someplace else that he's contemplating to go. There's also a play between that which is solid and that which is ephemeral, suggesting all kinds of other thoughts. So even paintings will find principles embedded in works of visual art. Well, as we were looking at that romantic figure staring off into the mountains and the clouds and the sunlight ahead, it reminds me of the fact that we have to be focused on a destination. Where are we headed? And the classical tradition of education has always paid significant attention to the aims that we seek or the ends that we seek. What is the end of education? And we really do need to begin with the end in mind when it comes to seeking to train up and educate and cultivate a human being. You probably already know that in the classical tradition of education is not primarily seen as job training. It's actually seen as the cultivation of a human being, a human soul. It's seen as something that is far greater than just earning a living, but it's much more about living well, right? So what are the ends that we seek? The traditional words would be words like this: wisdom, which is hard for us to define in this cultural moment; virtue, eloquence, what John Henry Newman called the perfection of our intellect, by which he did not mean becoming brainy and attaining a high IQ. He meant the maturing of our intellectus, the maturing of our human capacity to know and perceive and appreciate and love the things that are true, good, and beautiful. How do we capacitate a human being to become the fullest version of himself or herself? Well, this is going to be very important that we begin with the end in mind. A number of commentators would tell us that even our politics comes downstream from our culture, that it's not politics that determines culture, but really culture is having a fundamental effect on what we do in our body politic. And culture is a cultivation of a nation's ideals and ends, the ends that we seek. We could talk a lot more about politics and culture, but we'll pass. Education reveals those ideals. show me how a nation educates its youth, and I can show you what that nation values as kind of the good life, the summum bonum. What is it that we are seeking to pass down to the next generation? What is it that's being transmitted? What is it that we are hoping for? It's embedded in our curriculum, in our courses, and in our educational system. What would you say in your country the ideals are that the nation seeks as revealed in the educational system, its curriculum, etc.? So what is our view of the good life? The classical tradition of education begins with careful thought about what the good life is, what it means to be a fulfilled, happy human being. Let me quote a writer writing before World War II, W. Kane. He says this about education: human life has a value immeasurably beyond that of the daily details of living, and a purpose beyond its mere limited maintenance here on earth. He's thinking beyond even earth. He says human life is a gift of God, who in the very fact of giving it implies a definite use and end for it, for our human lives. If it were only an accidental thing to be held in an insecure tenure for a few years, the whole business of training new generations for its use would be quite futile. All its significance comes from that at which it aims, and all its details are measured by the definitive test of their furthering an eternal achievement. In another place, he says that the purpose of education is to prepare us for the next life. Who among us thinks that far down the road to where we will be in our next life? There's a kind of eternal aim that's a part of the classical tradition of education. It does focus on life here on this earth and the good life here on this earth, but it's not even limited to that. That's starting with, I think, the proper and a high aim. Now, if that's the classical tradition, even in our modern moment, there are educators and thinkers who maybe not even coming out of the classical tradition, who are starting to think about the problems that we're encountering and how we can do a better job of educating. One person like this is Dr. Tony Wagner, professor of education at Harvard University, who did an inductive study for this book, The Global Achievement Gap. And in this Global Achievement Gap, for this book, he interviewed military leaders, government leaders, business leaders, and he asked this question: what skills are necessary in the people that you hire in order for them to thrive and for your work and your enterprises to thrive? And after an immense amount of research, he summarized what's needed as 7 what he calls survival skills that would be needed for us to thrive in this changing global economy. Here's what he says they are. 7 survival skills: critical thinking and problem solving, collaboration across networks and leading by influence, agility and adaptability, initiative and entrepreneurialism, effective oral and written communication, accessing and analyzing information, curiosity, and imagination. Here's his commentary about these 7 survival skills that are so needed today. He says, however, in the 21st century, mastery of the basic skills of reading, writing, and math is no longer enough. Almost any job that pays more than minimum wage, both blue and white collar, now calls for employees who know how to solve a range of intellectual and technical problems, as we'll learn in Chapter 1. In addition, we are confronted by exponential increases of readily available information, new technologies that are constantly changing, and more complex societal challenges such as global warming. Thus, work, learning, and citizenship in the 21st century demand that we all know how to think, to reason, analyze, weigh evidence, problem solve, and to communicate effectively. These are no longer skills that only the elites in society must master. They are the essential survival skills for all of us. And then he says this: finally, I've observed that the longer our children are in school, the less curious they become. Effective communication, curiosity, and critical thinking skills, as we will see, are much more than just the traditional the traditional desirable outcomes of a liberal arts education. They are essential competencies and habits of mind for life in the 21st century. That's a very powerful statement from someone who has not been formed in the classical tradition of education, but someone who, as an education professor, has done a lot of research and concluded that the very skills that our leaders are saying that are needed today are the fruits of a liberal arts education, and that now more than ever, these skills and these fruits of a liberal arts education are needed by all of us, blue collar, white collar, all of us. Showing once again that this classical model of education has blessed and benefited human beings for centuries, and it is still what's needed today. We don't even know what the jobs are going to be in the next 20, 30 years. The research says that over half of the jobs that are going to exist, we can't even predict what they're going to be. But the liberal arts education is preparing you for virtually any future. So, just to cite that even modern thinkers coming outside of the classical tradition are, in some instances, coming back to it, returning to it. So we have this lovely reality of real truths that exist that can then be studied by us so that we can create a kind of harmonious understanding of how they all relate to one another. And we're doing this with education. We're looking back at the tradition. We're looking at these lovely ideas and practices that have been gathered and put into use by our predecessors, and we're seeking to recover them again in a beautiful way. It's going to be hard to summarize this model simply. We're going to do our best, though. I think we need to start with the essentials and then let the complexity kind of grow. But we don't want to start with complexity. We want to start with the unity and the essential aspects of classical education. So we might be, to some degree, in this introductory course, looking at the tip of the iceberg. We won't be exploring in great depth everything that's there. As I said, this is an introduction. But we want to start at the beginning. We will use some analogies to try to understand the classical tradition. There are many ways of defining it, and you'll see that in this course I will define classical education several times using some different techniques of definition. But one that I will use is an analogy. There's a sense in which classical education is like a beautiful cathedral with its various chapels and niches, with a kind of unified theme that takes us up and onward to a central location where we would see what the theme of a cathedral is. In this case, it's Mary. A cathedral like this cathedral in Orvieto, Italy, is immense and beautiful. It's been created over time. A lot of people gave their treasure and time to hand it down to us. We enjoy it without having built it ourselves, but we can enjoy it and preserve it and ensure that it's transmitted to the next generation. There's many things about a cathedral that become analogous to what it means to recover the classical model of education. So, in some degree, just like when we look at that cathedral that was built in the 1300s, we actually go forward by going backward. Sometimes that's just the quickest way forward when you've lost your way. We read in Jeremiah that we shouldn't remove the ancient landmarks, but we should keep to the ancient paths. Now, there's always room for innovation. There's always a place for trying something that's never been done before, and that's exciting. But there's also a place for conserving and protecting and transmitting to the next generation those wonderful things that have been cultivated by those who have preceded us. So there's both a conservative move of preserving the things that are very worthwhile and honorable and venerable, that are evergreen and will bless people in any generation. And there's also a kind of liberal move of trying something that perhaps hasn't been done before. But there's a sense in which we probably in this moment need to look back to the wisdom of the past, even as a way of innovating and going forward. It was G.K. Chesterton who said, every revolution is a restoration. Every revolution is a kind of return. think of it comes from the Latin word revolvere, which means, revolvere means to turn, and re means to turn again. So you can think about, if we start turning, if we're revolting, we sometimes revolve and come back to where we were at an earlier place. And this is why he's saying every revolution is a restoration. It's very similar to the way artists innovate. You can't become a great pianist or a great guitarist by ignoring the artists who have gone before you. No, you study the artists who have gone before you to actually find your own voice and style. Sarah says, we can go back. Well, we can't travel back in time, but we can go back in the sense of revising an error. And if we've gone wrong in some way, not in every way, but if in this particular cultural moment we've gone wrong in some ways, looking to the past can actually help us to correct our path. And this is what Lewis says in his essay on reading old books. He says that every culture goes wrong in some way, but it's rare that two cultures from two different times will go wrong in exactly the same ways. And so by studying the cultures that have gone before us, we actually can learn how to correct some of our own contemporary errors. Good ideas are evergreen. There are some ideas that are like perennial flowers. They just keep popping up every spring, and they're for every generation. And I would argue that's true of the ideas that come down to us and the practices in the classical model of education. To quote Chesterton again, he said that tradition, we think of tradition as kind of maybe a backward move, looking to something that's gone before us. I think that's correct. Tradition comes from this Latin word tradere, which means to hand down. We get the word trade from it. Well, Chesterton calls tradition the democracy of the dead. He says this: tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. So, just because someone has died doesn't mean that their voice ought not to be heeded. He says, in the democracy of the dead, all men at last are equal. There is neither rank nor station nor prerogative in the republic of the grave. So, we will give a voice to those who have gone before us. Certainly we'll listen to contemporary voices as well. We'll listen to modern research. Modern research actually can be very helpful in helping us refine the classical tradition. We might not accept all of the conclusions of modern research, but there are a lot of science that really actually informs and helps what we're doing. Every revolution is a restoration. I want to conclude just by thinking about how we are doing things again. The Latin prefix re means to do something again, to recapitulate, right? To revisit. Just think of all the ways in which, since we are seeking to recover wisdom from the past, we have to take a look again. So, we recover, we renew, we recuperate, we recreate, we restore, we reform, which means reform always has reference to form. So what is the form? We revive, we rebuild, we redeploy, we reappropriate, we resuscitate, we reaffirm, and we reapprove. That's reapprobation. And we actually are repeating something, aren't we? What I love about that word repeat, and we revisit, we review, but the word repeat comes from the Latin word petere, but petere means to seek something, to aim at something. We get the word petition from this, right? When you seek something, it's a petition. Even a competitor is someone who is seeking the same thing that you are seeking. And it's only a problem when there's only one office and two people seeking it. But several people can be competitors seeking and finding the same thing. Repetition means to seek again, or to aim at something again. Petere, to aim at. So what are we aiming at? So there's a sense in which to repeat the classical tradition is just to, once again, reorient our aim and our eye to properly orient ourselves to the good life, to the true, the good, and the beautiful, to the right aims. In this course, as a way of kind of re-aiming, we're going to define describe and defend the classical model of education. We'll also discuss it briefly, and I'm going to encourage you in your own groups that may be watching some of these videos to discuss and talk about the classical model of education. We'll have a lecture on deploying it in our schools and homeschools, developing it and deepening as classical educators ourselves. The basic syllabus is right here, and you've probably seen this already. We'll look at the what and the why and the how of the classical model of education. There's some resources for you to download: an introduction to classical education, a booklet, there's an article. There may be other PDF resources that are there on the page. I encourage you to look at those and download any that we may add in the future. There's some other courses that I might mention briefly. To go deeper into the tradition of classical education, I recommend the course that we have here on the site, the Liberal Arts Tradition. I also recommend the course that David Diener teaches on Plato, the great philosopher educator. There is a book associated with each of these courses. So after you take this introductory course, I encourage you to take a look at the Liberal Arts Tradition and the Plato course. So we'll go forward, and we'll go forward faster if we can return home. If we believe that we have lost our way, then the fastest way forward is to return home. Here's what Lewis says, just to quote him in conclusion. He says, "We all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you've taken the wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you are on the wrong road and progress means doing, then progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. There is nothing progressive about being pig-headed and refusing to admit a mistake. And I think if you look at the present state of the world, it's pretty plain that humanity has been making some big mistake. We're on the wrong road. And if that is so, we must go back. Going back is the quickest way on."